I don't know if you recognize the name Kyle MacDonald, but if you don't recognize that name, it is very possible that soon you will. The reason I say that is that MGM Studios in Hollywood is in conversation with Kyle MacDonald and his people about the possibility of bringing Kyle's story to a major motion picture. So if you don't know the name Kyle MacDonald, you might. Kyle is an internet blogger from Canada. Kyle was a young man some years ago with a dream of one day owning his own home. The problem was Kyle didn't have the means by which to do it. Didn't have the money necessary to be able to buy a home, and yet he continued to dream that that might one day be possible. He was thinking about it one day, and he got to thinking about a game that he had played in his childhood, a game called Bigger and Better. Apparently, in this game called Bigger and Better, the people who are playing the game together make trades. And the purpose of trading is that you're hoping each time you make a trade that you improve your place and your station, that things get better. Ultimately, by the end of the game, the one who has improved himself, herself the most is the winner. So Kyle was thinking about that game, Bigger and Better. As he sat at his desk thinking about it, he looked down, and there on top of his desk was one red paperclip. He looked at that one red paperclip, and he thought, I wonder if I could go online and start with this red paperclip and, well, see where I end up. And so that's exactly what he did. He went online that day and started a stream of trades that begin with that one red paperclip. He made these trades, 14 in all, before he arrived at a rather astonishing destination. I want you to listen to his trades. On July 14, 2005, MacDonald made his first trade, a red paperclip for a fish-shaped pen. Just a pen to write with. That's not much. Same day, though, he traded the pen for a hand-sculpted doorknob from Seattle, Washington. He kept working. His third trade took place in Amherst, Massachusetts, where he traded the doorknob for a Coleman camp stove with fuel. Next, in San Clemente, California, just down the road from us, he traded the camp stove for a Honda generator. Over a period of weeks to follow, he made several more trades. The Honda generator for a keg that was promised to be full. He then traded the keg to a Quebec comedian and radio personality for a Ski-Doo snowmobile. Within a week, the snowmobile was traded for a 2-person trip to Yak, British Columbia. He found somebody who wanted to go to Yak, and he traded that trip to Yak for a cube van, that is a box truck. Next, the box truck was traded for a recording contract with a music recording studio. Now, by then, people are getting pretty interested. A recording contract. Somebody was interested in that, and they were willing to trade 1 year's free rent in Phoenix, Arizona for that contract. So now Kyle is feeling pretty good. Things got really interesting after that. He found someone who needed a year's rent. That person happened to work for shock rocker Alice Cooper. She offered an afternoon with Alice Cooper for that 1 year's free rent. Well, whether you believe it or not, there are people in this country who would love nothing better than to spend an afternoon with Alice Cooper. One of them traded for that afternoon by giving MacDonald a motorized KISS snow globe. Now, you know what a snow globe is. You hear that and you think, well, you just went downhill. But wait a minute. It was motorized, and it was a KISS snow globe. Some of you will recognize KISS. Shame on you, the shock rock group from back some years ago. Well, it just so happened that there was somebody who collected snow globes, a very serious snow globe collector, that did not have that KISS motorized snow globe. And so he said, I will trade for that snow globe, and what I will give you is a talking part in an upcoming motion picture. And so the trade was made. Now he had what many coveted, a talking part in a feature film. he made his 14th and final trade, July 5, 2006. Just about a year after he began the process, traded a talking part in a movie for a 2-story farmhouse in Kipling, Saskatchewan. 14 trades from a paperclip to a home. Now you'll notice on the screen 2 pictures of Kyle McDonald and the paperclip, by the way, but also the house that he got. Now when I read that story, I got to thinking, do you suppose it's possible, if somebody can do something like that in the world out there, do you suppose it's possible in the spiritual world, from something that doesn't seem like much, for something rather astounding to come? The title for our sermon today is Serendipitous Magnanimousness. I spent about half my sermon prep time learning how to pronounce that. And once I could pronounce it, I couldn't stop saying it. It just sounds really good, Serendipitous magnanimousness. So spend half of your week learning how to say it like I did. What in the world is serendipitous magnanimousness? Well, serendipitous obviously comes from the word serendipity. Serendipity is that experience of finding something quite by accident that is very good. It's a surprise. You weren't expecting to find that, and yet, voila, there it is. That's serendipity. Now, magnanimousness is obviously related to magnanimity. Can you all say magnanimity? There you go. And that is generousness, generosity, open-handedness. Something that says, I will give you far more than you expected. So then, when you join those two together, what you have is somebody finding something very good in an unexpected place in time. In other words, at a place where you might have expected things like tight-fistedness and hard-heartedness, instead, you find generosity and open-handedness. That's what serendipitous magnanimousness is. So, with that in mind, I have a question for you. I would like to know if you would be willing to make the offering call at a certain church I know about. I would like to know if you would be willing to, in the service, come up to the front, stand at the front, and extend an invitation for everybody who is there gathered to contribute to the offering of the day. Now, before you agree or disagree to do it, it would only be fair to tell you something about the situation of that church. You really need to know 3 things about that church. The first one is this: it is a church in trial. In fact, it's a church facing severe trials, very difficult times. Now, you want to know that because you probably recognize that people who are in the midst of severe trial typically don't have a lot of thought, don't give a lot of attention to or pay much mind to other people and their needs. So you need to know that they're facing severe trials. Have you faced severe trials? I got to thinking about that this past week in my own life. Have I experienced severe trials? My mind went to something I faced a number of years back. You might not count it as such. I certainly did. Severe trial. I'll tell you something about that time. It was always there. It was kind of like a dark cloud hovering over my head. When I would wake up, which was often, there it was. When I would lie down to sleep at night, it was there like a lead weight on my chest. When I was making my way around the day, different duties, different activities, I found that I was preoccupied with that trial. Do you know what it is to be preoccupied? Just think about the word, preoccupied. It means that you are occupied with something before you ever get there. It's trying to cross the bridge before you get there. It is worrying about tomorrow while it's still today. Preoccupied. All kinds of questions. What am I going to do about this issue? What am I going to do if that happens? Am I going to be alert and aware of God's intervention in the matter? Am I? In fact, pretty soon I realized I was saying I a lot. I. It just got worse and worse. As I thought back on that this week, to face severe trial is to turn inward, to think about oneself. You're not worried about other people out there who have needs. So it's only fair to you to know that this church to which you will extend an offering call, if you agree, is facing severe trials. Now, maybe you can't relate to that kind of trial, but maybe you can relate to physical trial, physical difficulty. Have you been in physical pain? Do you remember what that was like? I've shared with you before, I've broken both of my forearms, both bones in each arm. One when I was a bit younger on a bicycle, maybe mid-teen years, bam, down I went, both bones broken. And then a few years later in college, I thought, well, it should be equal. So bam, in a football game I went down, both these bones broken. What I remember with some painful clarity was the ride in each case to the hospital. First time my father drove me. Second time my cousin drove me. Now, for some reason, the second one was even more painful than the first. And I can remember with clarity being hunched over in that car seat, trying to hold my arm down because every time I pulled it up, it kind of bent. And that didn't feel too good. Trying to hold it down and saying to him, hurry, hurry, hurry. I had no concern about his tickets, his driving record, anything else. Don't stop at stop signs, just go. And off we went. Other drivers, let them fend for themselves. I've got to stop this pain. That's severe trial. Your mind turns inward. It's about me. It's about the trouble I have. So you need to know, this church, if you agree to give the offering call, is facing severe trials. But there's a second reality you need to know. Not only is this church facing severe trials, but secondly, it's a poor church. In fact, to say it's poor is probably not sufficient. Somebody who knew of the church said it was a church that experienced extreme poverty. Extreme poverty. You know, the kind of poverty where the pantry is empty every day poverty. The kind of how are we going to pay the rent poverty? How are we going to continue living here poverty? What are we going to eat tonight poverty? That kind of poverty. Extreme poverty. Now the question is, what do we know about poverty? Honestly, we slept in warm beds last night. We all wear warm clothes today. Shoes to cover our feet. Most of us arrived here in cars that we own. We'll go out and eat from this worship service, a full meal for lunch. What do we know about poverty? Well, we can certainly imagine poverty. Think of this. If you had $2 in your pocket, $2 for the rest of the day, maybe the rest of tomorrow. In fact, you're not sure when more is coming. You have those $2 down here in your pocket. I'm going to take a guess. I know what I would tend to do, and that is I would want to protect this from anyone else. Take care of it because I've got these $2. Maybe I can get a pint of milk. Maybe I can get a couple of cookies. Stay with the health food for $2. And then, I don't know. Poverty. You need to know that this church faces extreme poverty. Now, maybe about this point in time, you will say to me, well, now, wait a minute, Randy, wait a minute. You're asking me to give the offering call? What are we even doing asking for an offering there? We ought to be giving them our offering. Why would we make an offering call there? Well, maybe so. But I'm still pressing home my question. But you need to know one third reality of that church. Now, this one surprises me. No. This one stuns me. Because in the context of severe trials and extreme poverty, this is the last element, characteristic I would expect this church to have. But there is one more that it has. It has joy. Not just joy, but overflowing joy. Now that truly stuns me. How can it possibly have joy in the midst of severe trials and extreme poverty? Now, the joy is encouraging to know that people, when they come in and when they sit down for the worship service, that they look up with a sense of eagerness and anticipation. They are joyful to be able to come and to worship God. So that opens the door a crack, and you think, well, maybe I could then make the offering call. Well, there's really one more thing you ought to know before you decide. And that is this. That is no hypothetical church. That's a very real church. In fact, it's a group of churches. A group of churches to which, had you asked them, who is your pastor, would have told you, our pastor is the Apostle Paul. Paul is our pastor. And Paul was in the midst at that time of collecting an offering for the poor Christians in Jerusalem. They were suffering back there. So Paul was making his way around, writing letters to the churches under his leadership, under his pastoral ministry. And he was asking them, will you contribute funds for this offering? He sits down and writes a letter to the church in Corinth. And when he makes his appeal to the Corinthians to participate in this offering, he ends up writing fairly extensively about giving. In fact, it will become the longest section in any of Paul's writings about the act of giving, what we used to call stewardship. He writes extensively. In that section that Paul writes, there appears what I would suggest to you, other than the texts that talk about the gift of Christ that God gave to the human race, other than that gift, there is a text in this section that I would suggest is the most astonishing text in the Bible about giving. I want to read it. 2 Corinthians chapter 8, page 1724, if you're reaching for a pew Bible. If you're reaching for a phone or a tablet, find the version that is today's New International Version. Here in this passage, he is beginning his appeal to the Corinthians for them to participate in the offering. As he does so, he is using the Macedonian churches as a model, as an example. He wants them to know this is what the Macedonian churches did, so that they can now make their choice to follow in those footsteps. So we'll read the first 7 verses, and then we'll come back and focus in on just one. 2 Corinthians 8, beginning in verse 1. And now, brothers and sisters, we want you to know about the grace that God has given the Macedonian churches. In the midst of a very severe trial, their overflowing joy and their extreme poverty welled up in rich generosity. For I testify that they gave as much as they were able and even beyond their ability, entirely on their own. They urgently pleaded with us for the privilege of sharing in this service to the Lord's people. And they went beyond our expectations. Having given themselves first of all to the Lord, they gave themselves by the will of God also to us. So we urged Titus, just as he had earlier made a beginning, to bring also to completion this act of grace on your part. But since you excel in everything, in faith, in speech, in knowledge, in complete earnestness, and in the love we have kindled in you, see that you also excel in this grace of giving. All it takes is reading that paragraph to realize that the Macedonian churches are a breed apart. Did you notice some of the things he said? For example, when he said, entirely on their own, they urgently pleaded with us for the privilege of sharing in this offering. So you can say to me, Randy, forget the offering call. You don't need to make an offering call. Already, those churches are walking in the door pleading, please, let us participate. Let us give. He says that here. And then he says, and this is also astonishing, that what they gave exceeded our expectations. Do you know how many pastors yearn to say that? Exceeded our expectations. Do you know that I and my colleagues are blessed, deeply blessed, to pastor a congregation where that can be said? In fact, may I tell you that this church last month, December, last month of the year, was very generous in exceeding our expectations in all of its giving, to tithe, to church budget, to building fund, to outreach space, to prayer ministries, all the giving of the church in 1 month, in December, last month, arrived at just under $3.7 million. 1 month. So when Paul says what they did exceeded our expectations, I say, amen, brother. I know, I'm with you, I'm tracking. Absolutely. So you read about the Macedonian churches and you say, wow. But that still is not the verse that stuns me. I want to go back and reread that verse to you. It's 2 Corinthians 8 and verse 2. We'll reread it slowly. Notice what Paul says in 2 Corinthians 8, verse 2. He says, in the midst of a very severe trial, their overflowing joy and their extreme poverty welled up in rich generosity. That's unbelievable. That's unnatural. Things don't happen that way. You know what Paul is saying? He is saying it's as though they set the blender on the kitchen counter and they said, we're going to make a concoction here this morning. We're going to make a certain kind of brew here this morning. And the first ingredient we're going to pour into it is severe trials. So they pour in severe trials. And then they say the next ingredient we're going to add to it is extreme poverty. So they pour in extreme poverty. Now that's a pretty bitter mixture. And so now they bring something sweet. And they pour in overflowing joy. And then they put the top on. And they hit blend. And that blends all together. And a couple of minutes later, when they remove the top, what comes welling up out of there? Rich generosity. And I say, how can that be? How is it possible that you mix trials and poverty with some joy and what you end up with is rich generosity? That's not the way things normally work, right? I mean, I can understand. If you say, we're going to make a drink here, and on this side, we're going to pour a very easy life. And on this side, we're going to pour a whole lot of money. And on this side, we're going to pour in a great deal of happiness. And now we're going to mix it all up. And when we open it, now we have generosity. It would seem to me that's the way we would expect it to work. After all, you know the human heart. I know it. In fact, our daughter Miranda helped me to know it and to understand it better. This was years ago. Now I look at Miranda almost eye to eye. Back when this happened, no such thing was possible unless she was standing on the bed. She was much younger at the time, and we gave allowance to our kids. At that day and time, it was $1 a week for every age of your life. So every week when she was 5, Rawson was 5, it was $5. When they were 6, it was $6, and so on. So they would come into my office, and it was allowance time, and I would look at them. I would look at Miranda and say, how old are you? And she would say, Daddy. I'd say, okay. And so then I would shell out the money, $1 for each year. And then we were there together. She would figure out how much of this is tithe, how much do I want to give to offerings. So I'd say, so how much of this is tithe? And she'd say, well, it's 60 cents. All right, very good. How much offering do you want to give? I'll give 40 cents. All right, so it'll be $1? Yeah, all right. Give the dollar, into the envelope it goes. She'd write her name on it. We did that on a regular basis. One day came along. I hadn't given her allowance in some time on that occasion. Don't remember why. Busy life, travel, something else. But we sat down finally. Okay, it's time to settle up accounts. And I figured out and said, oh my, it's a number of weeks. You're going to have a lot of money. So we figured it out, and I gave her $40, $50, $60, whatever it was, for all the allowance that we had missed up to that point. And then I said, now, how much tithe? And she started figuring and thinking. And then she said, well, that's $5. That's almost a whole week's allowance. And I said, yeah, I know. It's the same amount you always give. It's just all together right now. She said, that's a lot of money, Daddy. And right there, looking into the eyes of my precious child, I saw me. And I realized there is a tendency in the human heart that works something like this. Sometimes, the more we get, the less we give. And so I look at Paul's text and I say, what are you talking about? How can it be that people with nothing give a lot? That goes against the human heart. When we have little, we want to hold it. When we get more, we don't want to give much. We tend to be very selfish. And it's as though Paul writes his letter and this lesson very specifically to address the realities of humanity. And he is teaching us a lesson that says this: true giving has more to do with what's inside of me than what's outside of me. It has much more to do with the condition of my heart than the condition of my circumstances. It has much more to do with my spirit than it does with my wallet. It has much more to do with whether or not my attitude is one of tight-fistedness or open-handedness. True giving, says Paul, has much more to do with what's inside of me than with what's outside of me. And so I read about the Macedonian churches, and I read what they did, and I think, how could they do that? How is that possible? How can I be that way? Well, I think the answer is actually very simple and very clear. It's right there in the text. We go back to 2 Corinthians 8 again, this time to read verse 1. Notice how the text began. We read it a moment ago, but notice again. He writes, and now, brothers and sisters, we want you to know about the grace. We want you to know about the grace that God has given the Macedonian churches. Isn't that the way it always is? Anything good in our spiritual life, if we follow the trail inward, it always ends up at the trailhead of God's grace. It always begins with God's grace. Our salvation begins with His grace. Our peace begins with His grace. Our forgiveness begins with His grace. And Paul here says our giving begins with His grace. It's God's grace. That grace that is rich and abundant and free, that grace for our trials, that grace for our poverty, that grace that brings about our joy, that grace is the source of the generosity. That's the grace that we experience in our hearts. And thus it is that Paul can remind us, true giving has much more to do with what's inside of me than what's outside of me. So with that in mind, I have 3 questions for this congregation, faithful and generous congregation that I am privileged to serve. 3 questions for each individual here. Question number 1, how would you characterize your giving in 2012? As you look back over this last year, the 12 months that we've just lived through, how would you characterize your giving? Would you say it was generous? It was faithful? Would you say it was sporadic? It was occasional? Would you say it was deep? Would you say, well, it wasn't much? How would you characterize your giving in 2012? Second question. 1 year from now, when the year 2013 has slipped into the rearview mirror, how do you want to be able to characterize 2013? What do you want to be able to say about this year that we here enter? Do you want to say, my giving in 2013 was rich, it was generous? Despite my outward circumstances, I didn't forget others, I didn't forget God? What do you want to be able to say about your giving in 2013? And finally, the third question. The third question. What do you need to do this year to be able to say that about this year next year? What needs to happen in your life? It could be that you need to come to a place where, for the very first time in your life, you experience the riches and the abundance of the grace of God about which Paul writes in this passage. It may be that you need to stand under the drenching flow of His forgiving grace, changing and transforming your life. An experience like that will affect every facet of your life. You may need to renew that experience today, in 2013. Or you may need to say, in 2013, I need to be more careful. I need to be more thoughtful. I need to sit down and say, God, am I returning an honest tithe? God, am I giving to offering, to church budget, to the needy, to some project of charity in a way that reflects the liberality that you have bestowed upon me? Maybe it means that you need to be consistent with that. Every time that pay stub comes, that you sit down and give. I don't know what it means, but I do know this. I want to encourage you to live a thoughtful, intentional 2013 in the area of your giving. What do you want to be able to say at the end of the year? And then what do you have to do in order to be able to say that? 3 simple questions. Now, I ask those questions keenly aware of the fact that we live in very difficult times. Very cognizant of that. But I also ask that suspecting that somewhere in your wallet, somewhere in your purse, somewhere in your home, there's a red paperclip. And you have to make a decision. What am I going to do with that? If a kid named Kyle McDonald, with a somewhat self-centered and legitimate goal in mind, could create what he did out of his red paperclip, then what might be possible in my life, spiritually, with God as the source and God as the goal? And so I ask you, when you get home today, think of that prayerfully. And think of it with the realization that with God, true giving is much more about what's inside of you than what's outside of you.